Welcome to another episode of A Case for Death Metal's Greatest Album. Joining me today is Malus from Apokatastasis, who has recently released his sophomore album with a Withering of the Disconsolate. So, please check that out. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, hello. I also check that shit out.
Yeah. So, today we're going to be doing an album that, kind of means a lot, for a lot of people within this field and is, wouldn't say underrated, but kind of like a lot of people tend to ignore this band, considering what they've become over the years, right?
hmm It's like when you think of like symphonic death metal, like nowadays, it's like this very like overblown, caricaturized version where it's just kind of like Archspire with synths in a lot of way.
Yeah, or even metalcore to an extent, because the guitars, like, despite how present they are, rely on these very, very simple rhythms and, like seven strings and, just a ridiculous amount of layering that ends up sounding more like, Hans Zimmer than anything actually symphonic.
Yeah, but I feel like the primordial or even like proto sort of symphonic death metal had a bit of a different essence where it was kind of like treading the line between like OSDM and sort of like black metal sort of melody, but with more emphasis on, I guess, some neoclassical riffing or sort of strange romantic like chord progressions, like on often like non-diatonic type stuff that you'd see like they'll do like a really strange transition, but it still fits into like the whole of the song without it having a sort of chromatic character you do usually see in OSDM.
Hmm.
I'd compare like this band and like bands like it. Let's say I don't know Catacomb. You know them, of course,
Yeah,
right?
of course, yeah.
I'd say that like this is the answer to like or the death metal's answer to like stuff like Emperor or like Avigor.
Yeah, of course, Septic Flesh and Nightfall, to be honest. And obviously, I do think that a lot of these bands did stray very closely to black metal, which isn't surprising considering, I believe, the keyboardist in Necromantia, no, in Varathron Necromantia, one of them was actually involved in the production of the Temple of the Lost Race, and to an extent, I think, Mystic Places of Dawn as well.
Mm, I wasn't aware of that. But
Mm.
yeah, it seems like the Greeks had a very tight-knit scene with a lot of occurring motifs like the terrible drum machines.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I think, a lot of those bands didn't really care about, any form of stylistic purity or other. And, it's really what makes this album so strong. Um, you know, it, so let's start with, Temple of the Lost Race. Obviously this band formed in 1990. By 91, they had their first demo, Forgotten Path, which, it is very proto-Septic Flesh, but I wouldn't consider it part of the kind of continuity because it just sounds like what a band would do in its previous incarnation. How a lot of bands will change. For example, Immolation was Rigor Mortis, for a few years before and released a demo before becoming Immolation. And the Forgotten Path demo has a lot of it. It's still very anchored within the death metal of the time, doesn't quite break away from those traditions, and only shows very, very brief glimpses of what the band were to become. Whereas Temple of the Lost Race, and we were talking about this earlier, is in many ways the equal or better of Mystic Places of Dawn, right?
Yeah, I'd say that I haven't heard the Forgotten Path demo, so I don't have much to compare it to. But this just seems like, I guess, a more straight death metal like version of their sound that they'd adopt later because there's a lot more like shorter and chromatic riffs, while like the Mystic Places have like very, very expansive phrases that you couldn't even really call riffs. This has like a lot of like 1 to 2 bar like motifs that you'd usually find in like your typical like OSDM song, but of course with their own like flavor by adding their strange sense of harmony with the dual guitars and the synthesizers.
Yeah, in many ways, it is their kind of only, actual death metal release, right? In that it is still kind of kept in within the conventions of the genre, but like you said, with their own little twist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Should we start off with the sample?
Sure. All right, so Erebus. So this starts off. This is like I think a pretty typical trick of Septic Flesh, or at least it would on Mystic Places. They'll have this very embellished, mysterious intro that'll start off with just like a very creepy sort of power chord riff, playing some like maybe like a typical like OSDM type chord progression, or they'll play something a bit more neoclassical. But then they'll like slowly add layers because this one has those that clean guitar that plays, it originally arpeggiates like minor stuff over it. Then it goes into strange territory when it, transposes from C to E, which is like a major third transposition, which is like, that's usually out of left field for like this type of death metal. And then it adds like that harmonic minor chord, giving it a lot of intrigue and mystery to it, and then it randomly breaks up the flow with this riff that we just played at the beginning of the sample. And this is quite out of left field because it's sort of, I wouldn't say the key changes, but it's very chromatic compared to the stuff before, and it just breaks up the energy. You have the skank beat, power chords are flying all over the place. Then an abrupt pause brings us to the verse, which kind of reminds me of, something that they do on Pale Beauty of the Past, where they have that embellished intro, which leads to a sudden like a sudden pause and key change into the verse or meat of the song. And the thing is about the verse is that it actually shares, bits and pieces with the intro, but it's not like obvious enough for you to be like, oh, they're bringing it back, which is like, I think Septic Flesh is really good at like giving subtle hints towards like previous passages to like give the illusion of like familiarity, yet while like expanding the song in like very radically different ways. And then you have a very black metal moment during the end of the sample where it has that sort of a neoclassical, major seventh type harmony going on. And that's like like why I made that Abigor and Emperor comparison, because it kind of reminds me of that, especially when the key changes from they played an F originally, then go to like B flat. And to me, like the dual like guitar harmonies and just the sudden transpositions really reminds me of like a symphonic black metal band, like one of those two.
Yeah, definitely, and I think this is kind of one of their most kind of, obvious uses of the tactic where they'll present something that kind of is very, typical into a sense of death metal, right? Very simple, just kind of very blocky idea. And just the way they're capable, just by adding, very simple layers, quite honestly, on top of each other, and then kind of removing that initial idea and just giving the song like such an insane transformation, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they don't, and they're very good at doing this in a very, fluid and seamless way, right? Where
Yeah.
you really notice that things are like shifting, and that kind of like enhances that very romantic and emotional nature, despite Temple of the Lost Race not kind of falling yet into those excesses.
Yeah, it doesn't have the like really long phrases, or and the riffs aren't as like there's not as much natural minor stuff you'll find on the full length, but there's glimpses and pieces of it you'll see that they develop into later on the full length. But I kind of prefer the demo for to have like more, of the death metal intact because, I still like some of like the gothic influence, of course, that comes in.
Mm.
But I'm a death metal guy through and through. And so I just tiny or very, very little prefer this release over the full length, even though like in reality, like objectively, they're about the same quality.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly high quality stuff, and this is literally, one of the bands that, was forgotten for no fucking
Mm-hmm.
good reason. For the wrong reasons, but yeah.
I think like it's I think it like showed that harmony is important in death metal as well because as we talked about before, the layering is what exalts these riffs from, typical like natural minor or like your like death metal diminished sort of scale type stuff into something very very evocative because these harmonies are stuff you'd hear in like the sort of vein of like aristocratic black metal, but
Mm.
they're in this very death doomy context, which makes it a lot. The vibe is much more. I'm trying to think of like how to put it. It's not cold like the black metal stuff, but it still retains that same mystery.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. And like you said, what's funny is that a lot of those death metal parts, if you were to take them in isolation, they are incredibly bog standard for the genre, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also the fact that they're so kind of standard as well is what allows the band to do all these kind of crazy harmonic things, right? Because if you were to take something like, from Incantation or Suffocation, you wouldn't be able to do that because those riffs are so dense and so chromatic, and they kind of refused, you know, I mean, not refused, but it's very, very difficult to kind of harmonize those ideas, especially in this kind of gothic, romantic style.
Yeah, like if you like try to reharmonize stuff like suffocation, you get that like Jacob Collier try hard bullshit that just sounds like you ever heard the Cardiacs?
Yes, yes,
It's like the most goofy music ever. That's what it sounds like if you try to add harmony to suffocation. And I feel like I agree with like the sort of standard Hessian view that metal riffs are usually single note phrases, but I don't like think that's like the main rule everybody should strive to because something like Mystic Places of Dawn or much of the melodic death metal they can afford to have that harmonic density while still having melodic intrigue because of the riffs pertaining more to like a logic or typical logic and or are more simple, but it still has that like transgressive feeling, like
Yeah, no, I feel exactly what you mean, where Mystic Places, loses a lot of aggression. This somehow manages to keep it, just enough, just to get it a little bit of that, very satisfactory kind of release, right?
mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, do you want to move on to another sample?
Yeah, let's do the title track, Temple of the Lost Race. All right, so Temple of the Lost Race. This little clip, I call it the chorus. I don't know if it's actually a chorus because I haven't read the lyrics. I don't know if they're saying the same thing, but to me, it functions in the same way. This is like the part that gets you hyped up. But they take a while to reach it because, as you know, of course, Septic Flesh, long ass intro. But I think this song also functions somewhat similarly to Erebus, not only in terms of structure, but how they use key as well. Because as I say, um, Septic Flesh is sort of, death metal answer to stuff like Emperor and Abigor. There's a lot of key changes, and you won't really notice until you're like, a master of keys like I am. But yeah, it starts off in C, same as Erebus, but when it reaches this like the meat of the song, the chorus and the verse right here,
Yeah.
it transitions to E flat. And what's interesting is that these are, relative keys because E flat major is the relative of C minor. But
Yeah.
of course, since we're in metal, we're always using minor keys. So there's a bit to like throw it off, of course. But that's like that, like sort of, gray area, that ambiguous of like, so is this in key or isn't, is what metal thrives on.
Mm.
And I think this part is just, it is very, very, I guess, exemplary of the of the type thing that I think makes Septic Flesh, because this riff is so simple. It's literally you have the the octave to the you know major seventh, the harmonic minor, then you have the little Black Sabbath like perfect fifth to flattened fifth, and it
Mm.
just expands that to a more natural minor phrase. Like you'd hear this in like a fucking, I don't know, not a Deicide song, maybe a Morbid Angel song. But the point is that it's very simple power chord things. But what makes it stand out is this synth that's playing a very like strange chord. It's playing some sort of inverted suspended second
Mm.
parallel to whatever the power chords are playing. And the thing is about suspended seconds, I think everybody knows that as the metalcore chord, where it's like you stack the fifths. It
Yeah.
makes it very, very rich, resonant, and emotional. But since they're playing it parallel, it has this pseudo dissonance because there's some notes that aren't supposed to be there, but it still sounds so rich and emotional. Because when you have like this is in E flat right now, so yeah, when you have like that chord on the G flat and the fucking F, you're gonna have the seconds. They're gonna be in two notes that are not in the key that it should be.
Mm.
And even though this is not immediately apparent, because it sounds like decent, it sounds cool, you know something is a little bit up because this dense harmony has notes that aren't supposed to be there, but it meshes so well. And it just creates this air of mystery. I know I've been saying mystery this whole time, but that's just the word I'd use to describe the Septic Flesh sort of sound. Is that ancient, mysterious, romantic sort of death metal sound, and that's just exemplified by this very, I don't know, ambiguous harmony.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to add. It's that, the riff in and of itself, decent riff, we know this kind of riff very well, but it's just its relationship with the synth is so weird, and it gives us this kind of interpretation that is really unique. And despite being there, some distance, even on Mystic Places, all the way through their kind of classic, career, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've always had this kind of weird combination of like adding like notes that would be dissonant in any other context, but they always somehow manage to kind of like, force those notes to give the kind of that very emotional, very expressive, very, I know we say this word a lot, but grandiose because everything's big, it's not about,
Mm-hmm.
small emotions, it's about, big over the top, ideas and stories and mythology. And they're very good at doing that, um, despite despite it's kind of riff being, very standard kind of, like you said, minor scale riff with some few chromatic notes here and there.
Mhm. Yeah, and when I like call it romantic, it's like in both senses, as in romantic, as in like the very, very, literal sense, but also romantic as in romantic period, because this is when classical opted out of many of the traditions of, you have to go to the fifth before you resolve.
Mm,
And we can see that this occupies the same sort of melodic, I guess, transitory period where you have the consonant riffs, but instead of going, C, F, G, it'll go to C to F, then to E, then to, I don't know, D, like D sharp, then to G. But then instead of resolving straight to C, it might resolve to, I don't know, what's another way G resolves? Up to D,
mm.
and then it's a key change. It's just it always is trying to subvert your expectations and create this very delayed gratification sort of chord. These delayed gratification chord progressions where you don't know where it's going to go until it finally goes there. It takes you through all these twists and turns, and that's the benefit that I guess Mystic Places has, because the phrases are so long that they can afford to create these dense, like topsy turvy chord progressions that a 4 bar like OSDM riff couldn't.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, I think, it's really funny because I always love this stuff within metal, especially, when you have two albums by a band that are, somewhat similar, but then there's always the kind of big trade-off, right? And I think, the big trade-off here is like you have to here you have the death metal, the big chunky death metal riffs and the tremolo picked riffs, very in your face and aggressive. But when they really wanted to kind of push that, unique and really idiosyncratic way of their, harmonizing and the way they, interpret those melodies, they really had to push away the kind of death metal for it to, for them to really explore that route.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think we're pretty much done with, Temple of the Lost Race, and let's move on to the album now. Now, one of the main issues that this album suffers from, unfortunately, right, and the band have never really addressed, is that it's pretty much all done by a drum machine, despite the two drumming credits, which appear to be fictitious or some kind of joke from the band.
Yeah, I wouldn't know about like what the drumming credits are about, of course, but the drum machine is particularly obvious, especially during the blast section. One song in particular, I think it's Morpheus, has that one section where it's just like a 300 BPM hyper blast with just like there's like zero humanization. It's really just like it literally sounds like a cyber grind song.
Yeah, especially because it has the synths in the background as well, which makes it kind of, even funnier, to be honest.
Yeah, but if you can get past the initial, I guess like sonic displeasure, then you're basically listening to one of the best death metal albums of all time.
Oh, definitely. I mean, apart from the drum machine, which really does sound out of place, right? The rest of the production is absolutely flawless in this style, right? Of note, the vocals are particularly fantastic, very ferocious, deep, and but yet weirdly
Mhm.
understandable.
Yeah, the production and just like everything surrounding the sort of like sonic character of the album is quite particular. I don't know if like anybody will care about this detail at all, but compared to the EP, I couldn't tell what they were tuned to. And
Mm,
I know that sounds like a banal detail, but think about it this way. All of these like contemporary death metal bands, they love their open strings, You can hear the duh, 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 and you
yeah.
just be like, "Oh yeah." And you could just like play it on your guitar and it's just like, "Okay, they're in this key."
Mm,
But this album I couldn't tell, and I don't think I can still tell what's going on because they're always in such like odd, not odd, I use that word too much, but like they aren't just abusing the open string, is what I'm trying to say. There's
Yeah.
a
It-
lot of diversity when it comes to key. Like even like classic albums like, Dismembers like an ever flowing stream. They love their, open string. All the songs are in the same key because they love their open string, but this one has such a wide diversity, and I think that really comes down to the style of, I guess, more symphonic neoclassically influenced stuff. You want to have a diverse range of keys in order to properly you know I guess, express that. And it just shows that they really know what they were doing instead of just relying on the open string as a crutch, because there's just so many, different flavors of sound that come through.
yeah, so I did actually look up any covers, tabs from this period, right? And it feels like the consensus, weirdly enough, is drop D. But because, they're not like spamming power chords or as you said, the kind of low string attack, right?
Mm-hmm.
Open note, low string. It really doesn't matter, you know what I mean? I think it's I'm not even sure if maybe they were in D standard or whatever, but and people are just playing, doing these covers in drop D, for the sake of ease, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I think the only album that is tangentially related to kind of metal that I can think of that does that has to be the Blizzard of Oz by, Ozzy Osbourne, right? Where Randy Rhoads like wrote every song in a different key, so he wouldn't all be an E or an A.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if that's an influence, but then it's they only use like the open string, right? Especially the low open string when it kind of fits the particular melody at a given point, and it's interchangeable with any other note.
Yeah. One thing I want to say about the Blizzard of Oz, kind of off topic, all the songs I remember from it are open note ones.
Yeah, but it's not the
Well,
same
besides
key.
Crazy Train.
Yeah,
Like I remember Suicide Solution is A, Mr. Crowley is D. Actually, I don't know which one has E, but I know Crazy Train is F sharp.
yeah.
But unrelated. Anyway, continue what you were saying.
But I was saying, right. So one thing that kind of it does stray a lot from death metal and the inherited in thrash metal quality of the kind of low note, low open note chug. And also they very, very rarely use palm muting in general on this album as well throughout,
Hmm.
right? There aren't any, pretty much all of the kind of stocky and very aggressive character of the Temple of the Lost Race has been kind of wiped out, except the only time that you actually get some more straight ahead death metal is on the intro of a few of these songs. I'm thinking of like the title track, for example,
Yeah,
or Return to Carthage.
yeah. It's very, very rare when they give you just straight death metal. And when they do palm mutes, it comes off less like you know, very rhythmic embellishment and more of like a textural thing.
Mm. The only fully palm muted part I can think of is Chasing the Chimera, which, by the way, for those interested, we do have a written analysis on the website, which I'll link beneath. But that part, like, yeah, it's just got these kind of minor thirds that are all palm muted. But I think that's mainly, like you said, textural, and to really allow the kind of the solo on top to have a lot more space, because I think it would sound, even though they're like two note chords, it would sound a bit messy if they weren't palm muted underneath the solo.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but that's it. Start us off with a sample.
Title track, Mystic Places.
Wasted places. Let's go!
So about this section, I think this is more obviously the chorus and the quote unquote chorus of Temple of the Lost Race because they're actually saying mystic places of dawn. That's a pretty, obvious indicator that this is a chorus.
Mm,
And I want to, before I get into this phrase in particular, I'm going to give some more background on the start of the song. This song, actually, for the most part, doesn't have too many strange key changes. It's mainly between D, G, and C, which are all like right next to each other on the circle of fifths.
mm,
And this is already a bit different to what you've heard on the demo, which of course, as it has a more straight death metal character, the key changes are a bit more outlandish, but they, remedy this sort of I guess more simplicity with the lengths of their phrases and how I guess each part subtly connects to each other.
mm.
And I just want to say one thing. 1-6. What does that bring to mind for you? Chord progression 1-6.
Melodic death metal, like
Yes.
mid Gothenburg, like mid-period Gothenburg.
Yes. This whole entire first part of the song really, really digs into that 1-6. And you wouldn't be able to like tell unless you're really intently listening. And I've seen some discourse online where people think the 1-6 is like the bane of all metal because it's like slaughter of the soul.
Mm,
That's the whole chord progression. And I can understand it sort of, but that's a very, very surface level analysis because a chord progression isn't just, same notes. You can do so much with a chord progression. You can subvert it, you can add different layers of harmony, you can add, chord extensions.
mm,
But the thing is about the start of this song, it has the parts in D, G, and C, and they're all quite different from each other. But what remains is the 1-6 and how they play it. Like, for example, when they switch to C minor after that intro with, the sort of neoclassical sweeping part, it has a 1-6, but instead of like, the one being the minor chord and six being the major chord,
mm,
they're both minor chords that sort of emphasize this harmonic minor like tonality. But since it isn't like your typical harmonic minor, it sort of lingers on that major seventh with clashes with a lot of the, standard minor. And as I say before, it's going to be my favorite word on this podcast, mysterious. It's like, it's kind of augmented.
mm.
It's like similar like vibes to like an augmented sort of chord progression. But then they switch it to G and D, which is where they sort of mellow it out a tiny bit. They add, more natural minor sort of inflections. They change that minor six to a major six, fits more in line, makes it a lot more, I guess, reflective. And I feel like this chorus right here, basically it's taking the riff from 1 minute 20 seconds, which is also in G minor, and it's just adding that synth to it as well as the dual guitars harmonizing with each other and just making a sort of a climax for this part of the song. And one reason why I guess I'm defending the 1-6 chord progression is because they did all of this while maintaining that same chord progression, even though it feels like it's been like a whole adventure. And one interesting thing they did, besides harmonizing over the 1-6 in just like plentiful different ways to like make it seem like a whole entire different song each time, they do a very interesting movement, which is sort of like it's like a 1-6 at its like basis, but it switches from the major six to the minor six.
Mm.
So like on a guitar, let's say you have like you're playing 7 on A.
Yeah.
You'll go to the 4 on A, then to the 3 on A. And to me, that's just a very, very spicy version of like getting to that 1-6. And I've actually used it quite a lot in my music. It makes it sound more emotional because, it's the delayed gratification. You have your first chord, typical, and you go to the, major six, and it's like, where's the minor six? And then it hits, and it's just like, it brings it a lot more depth and emotion than it would just like your straight up like Slaughter of the Soul do 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 type chord progression.
Yeah,
It really
exactly.
yanks at the soul.
Because it moves around so ambiguously, right? Outside of like the kind of the realm of what we would expect from this kind of music and these very kind of weird harmonies. The tools that they have at this position are insane. They have synths. Sometimes you can hear like clean guitars layered with the synths with like little differences between both clean guitars as well as like there being a distorted guitar in the forefront. And it's just, the way they kind of take their time getting to those places, right? With those really long melodies.
Mm-hmm.
And then, it's like, I think this melody for me kind of exemplifies what early Septic Flesh is about. In that, it starts off very simple. And then on the second part, when it goes into dawn, the kind of higher scream, it's when there's that kind of almost, well, it is a key change, and they kind of play the most, realized version of that melody on a lead
Mm-hmm.
guitar.
Yeah, when he says Mystic Places, isn't that when the dual guitars come in?
Yeah, a
It really
dawn.
emphasizes that one to like the major to minor six chord progression because it's not right before it's just a typical 1 6, but then it goes into that sort of alternate version, which is sort of like you have like the Dorian sort of feel going from the major six to the minor seventh, like but then it goes to do, and it's like shoot, they really made the shit real when
Yeah,
they hit that.
incredible. Just in terms of like, this is one of the rare albums where I can really say there is orchestration because, despite the kind of set of instruments being limited, they use them in such curious ways. Whether it be, the kind of opening, nut keys, right? From the beginning of that melody, just before he goes to Mystic, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way he kind of opens that up, and all of that is essentially kind of like a very complex variation of that kind of opening, right? That builds off on, and they do so much as well with the clean guitars, the harmonized lead guitars, as well as the kind of the what the sounds like one guitar in the background just playing kind of like major and minor thirds,
Mm-hmm.
and they do so much, like every single kind of I mean, they make they almost kind of create more instruments with the way they divide everything up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it sounds massive. I mean, this part is absolutely timeless in everything. It's absolute. If the drums were better, this would be like perfection in a 12 out of 10 melody. But it's almost perfect. But yeah, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think Septic Flesh shows that with death metal, you can have your cake and eat it too because of all this stuff that it's just so dense, but it doesn't feel cluttered at all. Like you can have the long form melodies, you can have multiple synth layers, you can have all these guitars, you can have multiple key changes, but it doesn't feel like it's shoving too much in your face.
Exactly. Um, also, I always want to say, a lot of this reminds me of like the kind of best of video game music from the kind of, mid to late 90s all the way up to the 2000s.
Yeah, this is a fucking Castlevania soundtrack.
Exactly, in many ways, and also reminds me of the Deus Ex soundtrack. I'm talking about the original game, right?
Yeah,
Where
I haven't gotten to play that, but I heard it's good.
it is. I mean, I mean, it's timeless in the sense that um, it feels like both a soundtrack for like a medieval, maybe even Renaissance game, as well as something that could be used in a sci-fi game, right?
Yeah, actually, that is kind of right because hmm, actually, I don't know what point I'm making. I'm not even going to try to make a point, but I always thought that there was sort of this continuum between like sci-fi and fantasy
Mm. And
that
this and it
had this sort
exemplifies
of
it.
feel to it.
Yeah.
I can't put it in words, but I've always noticed it. And I feel like I see what you're getting at, like how sometimes sci-fi and fantasy, even though they're on the surface like diametrically opposed, they have this I don't know, maybe these shared characteristics. I can't put it into words, but I'm sure you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, it's the idea of kind of like we're gonna use this word a lot again, mystery and revelation put together
Yeah.
in this kind of like grandiose way, right?
Yeah, it actually is true because I feel like the main thing separating, fantasy, science fiction, fantasy looks towards the past, towards religion, magic, while science fiction, well, it's in the name,
Yeah.
science. They're like respective ways of finding out the mysteries of the universe,
Yeah,
either, magic or science.
yeah.
And sometimes they even like coincide with each other.
Yeah, I think emotionally, if we were to kind of remove a lot of the surface and to look at the best of both, they deal with very similar topics, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to another track. I know you wanted to talk about Morpheus.
Oh, can we go chronologically? I wasn't
Oh,
prepared. I need to like study that one
all right.
to bits.
What did you want to do next? Return to Carthage?
Yeah, return to Carthage because that's like a pretty different track. That's like one of the more that's like that could be on Temple of the Lost Race type track because it's
Yeah,
so quick and intense.
but at the same time, it still retains a lot of the kind of long form melodies and
Yeah.
a lot of the indulgence of this album at the same time.
Hmm. Yeah, let's play the sample.
Return to Carthage. It is cross. It's all that's possible. To the Duga.
All right, so return to Carthage. This is relatively simple and straightforward compared to other songs on this album. The riff is very, I guess, blocky and short and more based on like simple motifs rather than like expansive phrases. So it harkens back to Temple of the Lost Race era, but it still has a bit more complexity in terms of the harmony and synthage used compared to that era, particularly around this section. Because
Mm,
before you have your your 2 bar simple semi-chromatic tremolo riff.
mm,
And it actually does something that I said Temple of the Lost Race does. Remember how I said it had that relative like major minor sort of change from like
mm.
C to E flat, but instead they were like both minor instead of one being major. This one has that, but this time it's B flat and G. So it has a similar sort of vibe when it comes to those key changes.
Mm,
And what I find particularly interesting before this part, this is it plays that the beginning of the riff is in, or the beginning of the song is in B flat, and before this section here, they basically have this much more, I guess, grandiose and expansive Gothic sort of uh, riff play than previously. It's more of this album's character because it has a more standard harmonic minor chord progression with the synths laying a lot of like the groundwork and of course the solo on top of it, just making it feel a lot more big than you're, starting out with like a 2 bar like typical death metal riff.
mm,
But this is actually in E, the section we just played.
yeah.
And that is a tritone compared to the key we were in before. And if you played that without like all the harmonic like shit going on, it would just not sound right at all. Just imagine you're listening to, I don't know, bad comparison, maybe like a Taylor Swift song. And then in the middle of it, it just like changes keys by like a flattened fifth. And it's just like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
But for some reason, they're able to like write their phrases so they like meld right into each other, even though the keys should be like, the complete opposite of each other. And the thing about this phrase in particular, they also are doing another thing they did on previous songs. Like when I was analyzing this album, I realized that their language, like I don't want to say it's limited, but they have, you can see the tricks they have up their sleeve,
Yeah.
and that's not a bad thing. Like having tricks up your sleeve, that's how you create a character for the album. That's how you make your sound, as long as you're not like trapped. And I don't think these guys are trapped at all because they create a variety of different emotions with these few tricks up their sleeve. But anyway, what I'm referring to is when this changes to E, it has that same 1-6 progression. But as I
Mm.
said before, the six is in minor instead, emphasizing that major seventh lingering, just like you know, begging to be resolved, but it just doesn't. It's very, very. I don't know. I like these types of riffs because even though they're very melodic, they don't resolve, and they don't resolve typically. It's not like you're 5-1, and that just I don't know exemplifies a sort of, I'm saying it again, mysterious character because it just keeps on wrapping around each other and you're waiting for the one cathartic moment, but you're just not given it because you have these minor major arpeggios just being melodic enough, but not melodic enough to really give you the proper catharsis, I guess a typical resolution would.
Exactly, and it fits with the kind of narrative of this song, right? So, Carthage has always been, seen as this kind of, empire that was the most powerful in the world. Obviously, that Hannibal did, put Rome down to their knees once, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's the idea, fleeting empire. So, in that sample, which it also functions as the chorus, right? It works really well because, it is still, once again, mysterious, but it's a lot more of a sarcastic and sardonic mystery, because he says it in the lyrics. Return to Carthage, in bitter irony, the proud city lies raped, right? It's like this kind of
Mm-hmm.
like longing and sarcastic laugh in the background, and it just fits so well because that synth melody is incredibly ambiguous, right? I could not fi quite figure out what's going on there, and especially the guitars just make it even worse, despite
Mm-hmm.
how much the synth is overpowering them during that one segment.
It's a what I notice about the bell synth. It's a collection of seventh chords being arpeggiated, and originally it's a minor major seventh. You know what
Mhm.
that is?
Yeah.
It's basically you take your minor chord, but instead of like a minor seventh, it's a major seventh. So it has that major seventh sort of screwing things up between the minor chord. It sounds very strange, and they move that down to the C, and then they move it up to the D, and then it becomes a different chord. I don't think it's a seventh chord anymore. I kind of forget how it goes, but that's not relevant. What I'm basically trying to say is it's just the septic flesh, formula. You take this, let's say a 1-6, because this starts off at a 1-6.
Mm.
You de-metalcoreify it, you de-slaughter the soulify it by adding strange harmonies, then you expand it across multiple keys before ultimately like devolving it into like something that's barely recognizable within the key that it like would be, but still feeling like, this is like melodically related. It still feels like this is taking you somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you did say, their tricks are simple and they pretty, every single song uses these tricks, on the article I did for Chasing the Chimera, it's the exact same thing, except, on that song, it's a lot more obvious, the kind of, as well, the shift from major to minor and vice versa. But they're capable of doing so much with that one trick. It's like there are no repetitive melodies here, even though, you could kind of, we just reverse engineer the process, but that won't lead us to like making each of those melodies excellent. There's a lot of
Hmm.
experimentation on their behalf, because I don't think they had the kind of background where they were able to kind of figure out, oh wait, this dominant seventh goes with this chord or whatever. I think there was a lot of playing, and they had a very, very precise idea of what they wanted to do.
Yeah, the thing is like you can tell with a lot of death metal bands, it was just complete intuition that brought them there. Like a Demilich,
Mm.
like they nobody like I don't think any like theory head would make something like Demilich unless they already had like some very like idiosyncratic view of music. It's like only like a sort of like theoretical like amateur could make something like Demilich.
Oh,
But
of course.
here, like I see what they're doing, but it's like it's enough to like ride the line to like make you wonder. So did they like know what they were doing specifically, or did they just like vibe it out?
Yeah. I think, obviously I think they had a lot of experience. I think there was from, this was released 4 years after they started, and I think they took it very seriously from day one. And when you're in that kind of combination of when you're young, right, you have that kind of time to work on things seriously, and then you also have the time to kind of, play on things, right? I was recently reading a study. How it says it takes 10,000 hours to master an activity, right?
Yeah.
Apparently you can lower that if you're playing within the activity, if that makes sense, right? So instead of just like kind of jamming seriously, you mess around with your friends or whatever, but you're still playing, right? That can kind of like make the process a lot faster. And I think there's that, you have three guys who are very close, to this day, they still form the core of the band, right? Just messing around for hours on end, figuring up all these kind of dream worlds and eventually, getting to this through their own means, right?
Hmm.
Which I think they probably know theory now because they use such ridiculous orchestrations at this point, but I don't think back then they knew anything, and it was just really through trial and error and trying to to achieve a very specific vision.
Okay, this is also the I wouldn't say the chorus because there's no lyrics, or there is lyrics, but there's no vocals over this. But it's the main phrase of the song. I noticed that we've been choosing a lot of main like epic phrases for a lot of these because I think that's really what makes these parts stand out is that their density and their length and their but while still being catchy, it sort of shows you like Septic Flesh at their like peak moments. And this phrase actually, I'm gonna start off with a comparison. This might be outlandish, but Neverwhere from The Red in the Sky Is Ours.
Yeah, of course,
You
we
know
feel.
that one that one riff where it's just like do 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 do
Yeah,
do
yeah.
do. I find I wouldn't say they're of course not similar melodically, but structurally, I feel like those play a similar role because you get the intro, of course, then it breaks in suddenly to this phrase, which is like a big vibe, like sort of shift. But you can tell some shit's about to go down because of like how much the vibe has shifted. And it's quite a long phrase as well compared to like the rest of the song in both tracks. And the thing is about both of them, they'll be like suddenly like interpolated into the track at like random points, but never fully resolved. It just gives you little bits and glimpses of it. And
Mm.
because, it's such like an idiosyncratic riff in the first place, you like catch it and it's like, when you hear it, you're like, oh, but it's like you're fucking like swatting at like a wisp or something. It's elusive. It's just like in and out. But then it brings it back at the very, very end and it resolves it. And it's just very, very satisfying. And not only is like that type of structure, like I think neat and should be done more outside of those two songs, but the phrase itself has a lot of like melodic intrigue because a lot of the songs on this album, there are some, as I say, I guess, chromatic key changes, but this one, while like it is the most chromatic, to me, it is like the most like evocative, the most melodic, not is in like, strict melodic, but it like speaks to me like a melody
Mm.
because you start off in a C sharp and then it goes like do 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 do, and that's like, huh, it's in C sharp, kind of. It's arpeggiating that C sharp chord, but then it goes to the A like arpeggiation, which is like a strange choice. If I'm remembering correctly, mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh wait, they did it again. Okay, I didn't even notice this until now. They did another thing where it's like 1/6, but they're both minor instead of the six being major. But from there, you have a chromatic descent down to C when it goes like da na
Yeah.
na na. You have the no in there, and you want it to resolve up the C sharp because obviously it's a harmonic minor. The reason the major seventh is there is to enhance that resolution, but instead it stays at C, transitioning it to C minor. But it sounds so clean, and it has like da no 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 no, emphasizing that 1/6 again with the arpeggiation because the minor one chord is actually very similar to the minor six chord. Only the that one note is different. The transition from, I guess, in the context of C, the G to G sharp
Mm.
or A flat. No, 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 no. And it's able to like you know, easily transition to that within that C part of it. So that way it keeps, melodic consistency through the previous key change. But after that, we have yet another chromatically down key change when it goes from C to B with the da na new.
Yeah.
And it just is such a wide variety of different chords and keys. And they are like barely related to each other, only by like, steps, but they don't really share that many of the same notes. But it still sounds so like cohesive and like thought out just because the dense harmony is able to, rectify these differences between each of them. And then the last part of the phrase where it goes back to the C sharp, da, na, na, na. And this is the end part of the phrase where it stays in, C again, but this
Mm.
time it changes the synth melody up again. Da, na, 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 na. Then back down to B.
Mm.
It plays on that same chord progression, but just keeps on adding gradually to the melody and the harmony, and just creating mystery. We're gonna use that word again.
Yeah. I
And then
mean,
the phrase, it goes back into the beginning. Or is it the beginning of the song? Yeah,
yeah, it
not the
is.
beginning of the song with the part with at 040.
Mm. Because what holds it up together is that this is a real motif, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
the kind of the skeleton of the melody is outlined, multiple times within this song, right? It's repeated in many different ways, and it's just by kind of like, you know, it's one of those rare cases where this kind of like, constant and progressive, change of a simple idea works, without, obviously the steps, the large shifts in steps, like the kind of chromatic steps, right? that does kind of contribute to a lot of the contrast, but the ideas in and of itself, the melodies between, the notes between themselves and the melody don't vary that much from one kind of like permutation to another. So it always feels kind of, at the same, it's, the best of anything, be it, music, art, sport, whatever, science, whatever, is it doesn't, it kind of works within its contradictions, if that makes sense. And the contradiction here is that this melody never changes, well, pretty much never changes, but it always feels super different at the same time, And I think, the best of all kind of like, anything in general is when you kind of realize that both, the contradiction in and of itself can exist in both states without, without being able to, to kind of coherently understand it, if that makes sense, in that everything is so disjointed yet super fluid and coherent at the same time.
This is philosophic.
Yeah, but
I
you
feel like
understand?
Heraclitus right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm struggling to kind of make this point, but what I'm trying to say is that when you look at when the riff comes in from 1 minute whatever, and it just kind of evolves, and then they reuse it as well within 6 minutes, right? Where in six at the 6 minute mark, it feels a lot more climactic, right? It feels like it's
Yeah,
the climax of
how
the
it
song.
comes in at 6 minutes is particularly interesting because they don't even play the first part of the phrase. There's a part at 4 minutes where it goes to E and it emphasizes that sort of like Phrygian, like E to F, like do do, and it arpeggiates based off of that. And you'll get that clean guitar that's like, making a sort of point out of the, Phrygian minor second
Yeah,
sort of dissonance that's going on.
yeah,
But with the like sort of within a little bit of like an augmented progression. Or should we actually just play the sample before I go on?
yeah. Let's put it on.
All right. So I was yapping so much. I spoiled some of it. I
Uh,
wanted to get into this part, but it's fine.
mm.
What's difficult about this is that we're only giving you these very limited clips. If I could talk about this whole song, I would, but I'm gonna start at 4 minutes. I'm sorry, you're gonna have to wait a bit until we get the part you just heard, but I need to set up some context because at 4 minutes, we are introduced, it changes from the phrase that we're talking about
Mm.
into something. I think it was like, yeah. 4 minutes. Or changing to E minor with this Phrygian sort of emphasis. And you can
Mm.
hear it in the violins, which have a lot of vibrato. Oh yeah, I should mention. I can't tell if the violins on these are synths because there's so much natural like character and vibrato to them that they sound a bit more like real. And I
Uh,
know that like modern day synth architecture can make it so like you can add a bunch of vibrato to like a synth and make it sound real, but this sounds like it's actually being played to me. I'm not sure.
Now, you know what I think it is? I think it's
Mhm.
like a lot of stuff that goes on here. Some very clever studio trickery in that. I think there are so many layers, right? That are then kind of, exported as one layer that it makes you think that it's like a real instrument. But I think there's like a lot of different like violin synths, each doing something slightly different, and all of that is kind of like channeled into
Mhm.
kind of like one output, which really gives you the impression that it feels like a real instrument. Because I doubt they had the budget for this, unless let me quickly. I can quickly check if it was a real violin, but I seriously doubt it.
Yeah, because I
Yeah.
don't know. I'm gonna use this to make a
Oh wait,
point.
it was. It is
Oh,
it actually by Mr. Spiros Zevalekis, who only played on this album.
whatever.
Yeah, no,
That's
you're right.
funny.
But then
I
yeah,
knew something was up because I just assumed everything was like a synthesizer if it like wasn't guitar or bass.
yeah, same.
But I thought this sounded like unnaturally like clean, and it's like, oh shoot,
I don't. It
that's right.
sounds. It's maybe it's the production because it does sound quite very compressed to me. Maybe a bit too compressed to be, you know.
Yeah, that's probably it because the production. I like the production. I like how it obscures things, but it can obscure like little details that can make something like more obvious as to whether it's like human or computer.
Yeah.
But anyway, about that part at 4 minutes with the Phrygian E, um, that's going to be very relevant because that actually plays right before the 6 minute mark,
Mm,
where it transitions into the last permutation of that phrase. And it's just like introducing, this. It doesn't go right into that phrase right after this first repetition of it, but I just like how it was introduced before and how they're like melding these like bits and pieces of these elements, and just it gives it a much more climactic character. It's not like a squared four of this, four of this, four of this. It very fluidly melds like in and out of each other, and you can't even tell like, oh, it's this riff coming back. And that's also how I can compare it to like Red in the Sky. Not only just like the structure of how that phrase comes back, but just like how fluidly all of the phrases come together because they aren't using these like squared sort of deal, like these squared sort of I guess I don't know, they aren't pertaining to like the four by four type structures, basically what I'm trying to say. But
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean that's what I want to say. Where the kind of Red in the Sky really like abuses a lot of like atheist influenced rhythmic tricks. Whether when the bass goes out and it's just like a drum and guitar or whatever. Any number of tricks and like really harsh stops. Here it's these very sudden key changes and little changes within the harmony that just make everything feel so different yet so similar at the same time, which is what I was trying to
Yeah.
say earlier about the kind of making sense of that contradiction, which is why I think this song really exemplifies, because I think like you said, all these parts have the kind of same genetic material, but it's just they do so much with so little.
Hmm. Yeah, carrying on from that, it goes into a more that part at 4 minutes is quite doomy. Then you have, of course, like the clean guitar arpeggiating that those little like Phrygian embellishments, and then it goes into A minor, where like the
Mm.
violin is really, really you know, crying at you at that part. It's less doomy. I mean, it's doomy in the sense that it's like sad, but it's not as slow. It
Mm.
feels much more climactic with the violin being like and it isn't like your weird like your typical weird change you'll see in like the other parts because E Phrygian is actually a mode of A minor, so it's very very smooth while also being very very climactic and effective. And I think that's just the use of dynamics and how it changes from doomy
Yeah.
to like a more straight up straightforward type of melody. But after that portion you get a very very sudden change, which is in complete contrast to this gradual build up to this A minor section, where it has this like Return to Carthagian or like Temple of the Lost Racian, like pseudo riff that's just a bar long, and they're just
Mm.
like, and they're just like changing it up and down by a half step. And that's when the ridiculous like hyperblast section comes on with like the sweep guitar, and it just turns into Archspire, but it's better than Archspire, so don't take that too to heart. And
I
you
mean,
have this
the,
crazy
the and the solo on top of that sweeping section, which is I don't
mhm.
know what it is with that sweeping section, but I can't really fully make out the notes because it feels like the notes are kind of swelling in and out.
I say it again.
I was just saying, like, that weird sweeping section sounds really weird because it feels like when the guitar solo comes on top, the notes are swelling in and out. You know what I mean? Like it swells, large
Oh
swells
yeah,
in volume.
you want to know? I should have mentioned this earlier, but I think part of why this album has like such good dynamics, they played a lot with guitar panning. I can tell some parts only one guitar is playing, like in the middle, then two guitars are playing on the side, and
Mm,
they're all like very different pannings in order to, occupy the right space. I should have said that during the production part, but I've noticed that. Like, did you notice at the beginning of Mystic Places, it's just like a center guitar
yeah,
playing one thing, and then like when it kicks in, it's two guitars on the side, and it's like you won't notice that, but it gives like the subconscious impression of like some sort of expansion. And I'm guessing here it changes to like one guitar in the rhythm instead of two in order to, I guess, add some contrast to the previous section and make it sound, I guess, a bit more subtle if they were to like put two guitars. But yeah, after that section, which is just like completely out of left field, it goes, that one's an E minor. It goes into that E Phrygian, with the violin.
mm,
And you're just like, okay, they're bringing this phrase back again. But then it brings back the final permutation of the phrase I've been gushing about. And it starts it on like the second or third bar instead of the beginning. And it's like, that's spicy. Like,
yeah,
that's just, I don't know. It's like, I'm trying to think of like a way that to put this that isn't just like so stupid sounding. But it's just like when a jazz drummer like brings in that fill on the off time beat, but it like just hits right. That's what it feels like. But it's like for romantic fucking melodic death metal. When it does that, it's like right. It's just teetering on the edge of falling off, but it hits it just right. And it's like, damn, they really brought it back.
yeah.
And that's
And
how I
then
feel when it goes from
at
into
six
that phrase.
at 620, they take one of the previous harmonies, right? And they just shove it on top, and it just feels completely different once again.
Yeah, they change it up a tiny bit to give it more finality. And they take the last bit of the phrase that initially played, da, na, 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 na,
Yeah.
na, na. But instead of like letting that go, it just drones on that for a while and it sounds much more climactic. It doesn't sound as mysterious. It just becomes somber at that point.
Yeah.
And
It,
there's
it-
still that they still hit that beat. It's still a bit topsy turvy, but it's it's somber, but it still wants to remind you that it's not over yet. We still have some mysteries to solve. We're like fucking Scooby Doo.
yeah, I'll see you next time, gang.
They bring in Mythos. I like Mythos, but I guess Mythos isn't that relevant to the metal part. I still think it's a cool
Yeah,
track.
it's a fantastic song. I always liked it as an ending, you know,
Mm-hmm.
'cause I do think that obviously these guys were definitely inspired by the bands around them as well as the Peaceville 3, right? Because the Peaceville 3 did have a lot of those ideas, I th but I think that non-metal influences are really what shaped this up. There's definitely an understanding of like, leitmotifs to an extent, that comes from like, movie because I'm not sure if I'm guessing these guys were probably a bit into opera, but mainly into kind of like 80s movies, when they still had soundtracks and every character had their own theme. And it just feels like that, you know what I mean? It's like, because
Mm-hmm.
every song is so distinctive and yet it relies on like one main melody. And because a lot of these songs are about characters, places, various mythological beings at any one point, it it always struck, especially this song strikes me as like that melody is like the leitmotif for Morpheus, the god of dreams, right? To come
Mm-hmm.
down and, to give you his wisdom in your sleep, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was like thinking when I was comparing it to like romanticism, because you had like fucking Wagner and what was it called, programmatic music,
Mm,
where they just like it just be like but that's when they introduced leitmotifs and it was like introduce a character. And I feel like even if they like weren't, of course, like professionally studied in classical and all that. Movie soundtracks sort of took that strain of romanticism and just like made it their own thing. Like that's where you get your like John Williams or whatever and
Yeah,
shit. You'll have like Superman do 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 do.
exactly. And I'm thinking, what would have been the big thing for those guys, like Darth Vader's theme, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's every time Darth Vader appears, that theme is always slightly changing, right? But it's still that one recognizable leitmotif, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so I think we're done with this one. All right, let's move. So what happened next for this band?
Um. Shoot.
So I was thinking two fantastic releases.
Oh yeah, I forget. I forgot. I forgot that they had two good ones after this.
So they had Ezoptron, right, which was a lot more of a return to kind of many of the ideas that they had on Temple of the Lost Race. A lot more aggressive, just as good as this one in many ways, but it felt like a continuation of Temple of the Lost Race, but with some of the ideas from here, kind of weird mishmash of two of of both of them, and then the Ophidian Wheel,
That
which
one's
was
kind of like heavy metal. That's like had more like Verathron Necromantia, where it's like semi heavy metal.
yeah, it was a complete it was a departure. You know, the Ophidian Wheel is them really saying goodbye to death metal at that point, while still keeping some elements of it, even more lightly than this one.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, I
then
am not as familiar with those. I should probably get into Ezoptron, considering that it's you say it's Temple of the Lost Racian.
yeah, it's Temple of the Lost Racian, but also Mystic Places of Dornian at the same time. It's a very
Yeah,
interesting synthesis of both, whereas the Ophidian Wheel is you know, all is Mystic Places of Dawn pushed to its kind of logical end.
yeah. This I don't remember that much about it. I just remember a lot more like mid-paced heavy metal sort of type riffing where it's like chuggy, mid-paced, and it's more like a lot more gothic metal than like straight death metal. Well, this is like has more like the gothic elements on here are like a bit more subdued. Well, I wouldn't say they're subdued. They're quite obvious, but
Mm.
it's like that doesn't feel like the album. This is still a death metal album at the end of the day. While Orphidian Wheel kind of it toes the line a bit more.
Yeah, of course, obviously, Soterus, um, what do you call it? Soterus kind of like he discovered that, wait, I actually have a pretty cool singing voice, and he starts using that on the Ophidian Wheel, and it has a lot more. It gives them a newer dimension that they didn't quite have, and then it continues. I think the Eldest Cosmonaut is it's a decent EP. It's okay, and before what's the Fallen Temple is when things start going downhill. To be honest, it's like this kind of weird mix between what they were going to do later and what they were doing, and the re-recorded versions of the Temple of the Lost Race songs. Interesting to say the
They
least. Not
neutered them.
Yeah, new exactly.
I
They
mean, not like that's not even like that's only like semi like figurative because they actually just snipped them. They literally snipped them because they're like half the length of what they should be.
half length as well. A lot of the layers are removed and they replace them. This is like the kind of when they really started to get into like digital synths. This is like yeah, late 90s. So this is when digital synths were like all the fucking craze, but they still sounded like absolutely terrible. Unless you could like hide them or something. I'm thinking of you know, the Fallen Temple version of Erebus, which is just it's quite laughable because obviously, a lot of the Norwegian black metal bands were in that kind of carnival period, a lot of carnival sounds. And Septic Flesh weren't really good at using those carnival sounds, to be honest, on Fallen Temple. And they sound very weird on the re-recorded tracks of Temple
Yeah,
of the Lost Race.
it was released the same year as Anthems, which I think has like that was like the I had like the ultimate carnival metal like synth like patches.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So yeah, what about this al does this album even have a legacy, or has everything just been covered by kind of when did this band really get big? I think it was really like 2006 Communion or whenever it came out, that album.
Yeah, that's when they had, I guess, their rebrand and they just like sort of strayed. Yeah, that's when they made it Septic Flesh instead of Septic Flesh, you
Yeah,
know?
one word instead of two. Yeah,
I
no,
just remember like one of the song I was listening to this album in the car and Spotify made it one of the communion songs and I literally had to turn it off. It was just so bad.
yeah,
Like I was on the fucking highway going, I don't know, 80, 90, and I heard that and I was like, if I just die right now, if I get in an accident, I won't care because I can't listen to this song anymore.
yeah. I mean, so it was 2003 that Sumerian Demons, right, which really started this, where you know you can already tell just by the names of the lyrics where it's just kind of like they're sticking to a theme which isn't really at this point Samaria had been bled out in metal just in general, Samaria, Babylon,
Morbid Angel.
Mesopotamia. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it had been bled out and they're continuing on it. um this is when the when the more kind of like sexualized images start, because have you ever seen the Digipack reissue art for Mystic Places of Dawn?
Um, is that the one on Spotify?
No, there's another one just for the Digipack. It's literally just a girl flashing her tits with
Oh,
like
I
a
see
mouse.
this.
Yeah, and that was it.
This is terrible. This is even
Exactly.
worse than the Spotify one. What the hell?
Yeah, exactly. And
I mean, then again, like the original cover is already quite sensual because it's like some demon and this chick. Like, I don't even know if they're, I don't know if they're fucking yet, but it kind of seems like they are. Like they're like a couple seconds away from it.
yeah, but it has the sense of mystique. It's like the kind of old Nosferatu themes. Like what's going to happen, but they're in this kind of like weird ruins that almost look like a cave at the same time, and
Yeah, it's
yeah,
a lot less. It feels like more like a very, very suggestive sort of sensual.
exactly.
Like more, I don't know, Depeche Mode, less Nine Inch Nails.
Exactly. But yeah, what I mean, it's a shame for, how they decided to rebrand and kind of re-see themselves as some kind of like weird symphonic gothic band. And unfortunately, luckily for them, they got success and, I'm glad they're making money, but their greatest material, stuff that really could have redefined metal to a really
Mm-hmm.
large extent had it been, unearthed, kind of unfortunately goes unnoticed. And with the shitty reissues, like the cover art on the reissues is so bad, it's not even worth having at this point because of how ugly they look. It's just gonna get worse.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. Like, I usually try to stay away from the sentiment that, like, oh, their old material is their best. But in this case, it really is, like, pretty true.
Yeah, I mean it is, and everything they kept from their old material isn't the stuff that made Septic Flesh special at all, right? It's
Hmm.
it's it's not just the kind of superposition of synth and distorted guitar that makes Septic Flesh good. It's all those things we talked about, and there was a real sense of like orchestration, but now you can tell it's like fucking Hans Zimmer patch with AI assistant to properly fucking give you the partitions, and you shove it into a MIDI thing, and then that damn it just puts it on the track, right?
Yeah, I can't even speak that much. I just heard, like, that one song for, like, 20 seconds, and it's like, okay, yeah, I would not like this. But the old stuff, I don't know. You asked if there was a legacy.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I feel like a lot of these bands, like, or they I'm trying to think of a way to say this, but they sort of bands that are similar, like grew up like independently and had their own sounds, and they don't really have legacies. Like you can't. I'd say that like even though Septic Flesh is more gothic
Mhm.
themed, of course, I'd say stuff like the Chasm or Catacomb is like stylistically similar. but I don't see anybody worshiping like Catacomb or the Chasm, like
Yeah.
at least explicitly. And I see that being the same for this album, where it has like some like stylistic similarities with, of course, contemporary bands that played this style of like pseudo progressive, melodic, synth death doom. But there's not really any one like, album that I think garnered a specific legacy. I think if anything, it should be this album because I feel like that is like the peak of that style. Because of course, I think the Chasm falters in the amount of meandering that they do, and I don't know. I don't. Catacomb is cool, but it's like I just didn't like him that much. I can't really explain it why. I feel like Septic Flesh was just like the best to do that pseudo progressive, like melodic death doom type sound with a lot of synths.
Yeah, exactly. You know, this is definitely the best exponent of that style then, which is funny because that style did, is huge technically now. You know, you look at all these bands on Nuclear Blast with, tens or 20 of millions of views, right? Which I don't keep up with anymore at this point, but there is a huge market for this. And this is the album that, the whole genre should have been modeled after, but it just kind of got forgotten. But yeah, that's that. So any final words?
Listen to this album or you're a poser.
All right. So thanks again, Malus, for joining us. For those listening, check out his new album, Apokatastasis, The Withering of the Disconsolate, and we'll see you next time.